Have you heard the stories, the ones where a soul was traded like gold? Where a daughter's fate was sold by her own father, for reasons no one ever knew. They whisper of an outlaw who paid the price, not just for her body, but for her very soul. And on that same night, a shaman saw her figure in the fire. He said she would be the one to change their destiny. But tell me this, can a bargain with the devil ever bring salvation? The wind carried dust across the ranch's broken fences. A young woman stood in the doorway, her hands gripping the frame, staring at the horizon as if searching for a way out of a life she never chose. By the corral, her father clasped hands with a man twice her age. Their words were low, their expressions hard. The deal was struck, his daughter traded for land and protection. The wedding came without music, without celebration. A preacher mumbled vows over the dry wind. She kept her gaze on the ground, willing herself not to cry. Her new home was a one-room shack on the edge of nowhere. The air was stale with the scent of old whiskey. Dust coated every surface, even the bed where she would now sleep. Days passed in silence. She moved like a shadow, speaking little, always careful not to draw the man's attention. At night, she listened to the wind, and sometimes, to sounds she could not name. Far away in the mountains, an old Shawnee shaman sat before his fire. The flames twisted and formed the image of a woman's face, a stranger to him, yet one he knew would change his people's fate. The stars will fall 3 times, the shaman whispered to the night. And she will lead us through betrayal. His voice carried beyond the mountains. A young warrior named Tahama heard the prophecy. In his language, his name meant thunder that echoes from the mountains. Without hesitation, he vowed to find her. He rode for days across plains and rivers, the peaks fading behind him, the open land stretching endlessly ahead. Each mile brought him closer to the unknown. At sunset, the wind carried a scream to his ears. Tahama turned his horse toward the sound, his hand reaching for the knife at his side. In the fading light, he saw her, the woman from the shaman's vision. Her dress was torn, her eyes fierce despite the fear. 2 men towered over her, one raising his hand. Tahama struck like a storm, swift and merciless. In moments, the men lay in the dust, and he was lifting her onto his horse. Without a word, they disappeared into the night. The night air was cold against her skin as the horse thundered over the open plain. She clung to the saddle, the world rushing past in a blur of moonlight and dust. Behind them, the shack was already swallowed by darkness. Tahama did not speak, his eyes fixed ahead, guiding the horse as if he knew every shadow on the land. Only when the mountains began to rise in the distance did he slow the pace. At the edge of a shallow river, they stopped to rest. He dismounted first, then offered his hand. She hesitated, but the steadiness in his gaze made her take it. They drank from the cold water in silence. She wanted to ask who he was, why he had risked himself for her, but the words would not come. In the distance, an owl called, its voice echoing across the valley. By dawn, they reached a narrow canyon path. The rising sun painted the stone walls in deep gold and crimson. She had never seen land like this, raw and endless. As they rode deeper, the air grew cooler, the scent of pine mixing with the sharp tang of stone. Tahama's shoulders stayed tense, his head turning often to scan the ridges above. She noticed the bow and quiver at his back, the way his hands rested lightly on the reins, ready to act in an instant. Midday found them overlooking a wide valley dotted with campfires. Smoke curled into the blue sky. He pointed toward it and spoke a word in a language she did not understand. She guessed it meant home. When they reached the camp, people paused in their work to watch. Women in buckskin dresses, children chasing each other through the dust, elders seated in the shade, all eyes followed her. Tahama led her to a large fire at the center, where the old shaman waited. His weathered face broke into a slow nod, as if greeting someone long expected. He spoke softly to Tahama, then looked into her eyes. Though she could not understand his words, she felt the weight of his meaning. That her life was no longer her own, and that her path here had been written before she was born. That night, the camp was alive with the sound of drums and low voices. She sat apart, the firelight flickering over her face. Tahama joined her, offering a piece of roasted meat. She accepted it without meeting his eyes, but her hands no longer trembled. In the darkness beyond the fire, shadows moved, warriors keeping watch. Somewhere deep inside, she began to feel the first fragile thread of safety. Days blended into one another beneath the open sky. At first, she kept to the edges of the camp, speaking only when spoken to. She watched the women weaving baskets, grinding corn, tending fires. Children would pause in their play to stare at her pale dress and unfamiliar face. Slowly, she began to trade nods for nods, glances for glances, until one morning an older woman pressed a clay cup of warm herb tea into her hands. It was the first kindness she had felt in years. Tahama came and went, often returning at dusk with rabbits, deer, or fish. He spoke little, but his presence was steady, a quiet reassurance that she was no longer in the hands of cruelty. She began to notice the way the camp moved as one body, the rhythm of tasks, the laughter that rose with the crackle of fire, the way each person's work mattered. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The sky turned the color of lead, and wind whipped the smoke from the fires into long ribbons. Tahama appeared at her side, guiding her to shelter in a low tent covered with hides. Inside, she could hear the drumming of rain on the roof, and for the first time in a long while, she felt no urge to run. The storm passed quickly, leaving the air fresh and cool. The shaman sought her out that evening. His dark eye studied her as he placed a small beaded necklace in her palm. The beads were warm, as if they had been resting in sunlight. He spoke a few words, and Tahama translated, "You are under the protection of this camp." She closed her fingers around the necklace and felt its weight like a promise. Over the following days, she tried her first words in their language. The children giggled at her mistakes, but they helped her repeat them until she could make the sounds right. She learned to grind corn into fine meal, to stitch leather, to braid rope from rawhide. Her hands grew calloused, her steps more sure. One night, as the fire burned low, Tahama sat beside her and asked, "Do you still think of the place you came from?" She stared into the embers for a long moment before shaking her head. "Not in the way I used to," she said quietly. And though she did not say it aloud, part of her knew she no longer belonged to that other life at all. The days that followed moved slowly, like the river bending through the valley. At first, she kept to herself, rising early to help fetch water or tend the fire, careful not to draw attention. The women of the camp watched her with quiet curiosity, whispering words she could not yet understand. Children ran close enough to see her face, then darted away laughing, as if she carried a secret. Tahama checked on her each morning, speaking in his language, patient even when she could not answer. Sometimes he would point to objects, the sky, the earth, the water, naming them for her to repeat. At night, she lay on a bed of furs inside a small lodge he had given her, listening to the hum of the camp, the crackle of fires, and the distant cry of coyotes. The shaman came often, sitting by her side without speaking for long stretches. His presence was like the mountains themselves, solid, unhurried, watching. One evening, he gave her a beaded necklace and touched his forehead to hers. Though she did not know the ritual, the gesture warmed her more than any fire. Her first real conversation came with an older woman named Wire, who brought her food and smiled with kind eyes. Wire began teaching her words, correcting her gently when she stumbled. Slowly, sounds became shapes in her mind, and meanings began to take root. She learned the word for family before she learned the word for stranger. One afternoon, Tahama returned from a hunt carrying fresh deer meat. The camp stirred with activity, women preparing hides, men sharpening tools. He laid the gift at her feet, and though her cheeks burned, she thanked him in his own tongue. The smile he gave her was small, but it stayed in her thoughts long after night fell. As the moon rose high, drums began again, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat. She sat closer to the fire this time, letting the warmth touch her. The voices around her no longer felt foreign, but like waves she was learning to swim in. When Tahama sat beside her, she did not look away. In that moment, she realized the weight she had carried since the shack was slowly lifting, replaced by something she could almost call hope. The ridge smoke did not fade. By the next morning, the scent of it reached the valley, sharp and bitter, carrying the memory of burnt wood. The camp stirred early, warriors checking their weapons, women packing food and water skins. She helped wire tie bundles, her hands moving quickly even as her mind swirled with questions she could not yet ask in their language. Tahama rode out at dawn with a small group. He gave her a brief glance before leaving, the kind that carried more meaning than words. The hours dragged in heavy silence. Children were kept close, the fire pits left cold. She sat near the shaman, watching the edge of the valley as if staring hard enough might bring them back sooner. When they finally returned, the sight of them made her heart twist. Dust clung to their clothes, and one rider's arm was wrapped in blood-stained cloth. Tahama's jaw was set, his eyes dark. He spoke quickly to the shaman, his hands cutting the air in sharp gestures. She could not follow the words, but she caught the name repeated more than once, a name she had heard in whispers before: white traders. That night, the camp stayed quiet except for the crackle of a single central fire. Tahama came to sit beside her. "They burn what they do not take," he said slowly, choosing words she would understand. "They will come for this valley." His gaze met hers, and she understood, not as a warning, but as a truth already set in motion. Sleep did not come easily. She lay in her lodge, listening to the distant howl of coyotes, wondering if the hoofbeats she imagined in the dark were real. Somewhere deep inside, an old part of her, the part that had survived the shack, began to awaken. She remembered the way her father's people thought, how they bargained, how they lied. If danger was coming, she might know the shape it would take. By dawn, the air felt heavier. The shaman called the camp together, speaking in a voice that carried across the open space. Though she understood only fragments, she caught the meaning: preparations must begin. And as she stood among them, clutching the beaded necklace, she realized she was no longer only a guest in this place. She was part of it, and the coming storm would not pass without her standing in its path. The first sign came at midday, a dust cloud on the far edge of the valley. At first it seemed harmless, just wind lifting the earth into the air. But the shaman's gaze fixed on it too long, and soon she saw the dark shapes moving within it. Riders. Word spread quickly through the camp. Women gathered the children into the lodges, warriors moved to the valley's edge. Tahama approached her, his voice low. "Stay close to wire. Do not run unless I tell you." His tone carried no room for argument. From the shadows of the lodge, she watched the riders approach. They were dressed not like the townsmen she had known, but in a mix of frontier coats and patched uniforms, each carrying a rifle. At their lead rode a man with a pale scarf tied at his throat, a mark she remembered from whispers in the shack. He dismounted slowly, scanning the camp as if counting what would be his. They spoke to the shaman in harsh, clipped English, demanding trade, demanding land. The shaman stood firm, his words calm but unbending. She saw the lead rider smile, thin, cold, the kind that came before trouble. Tension snapped in an instant. One of the riders raised his rifle, and before she could draw breath, Tahama was there, shoving the barrel aside. Shouts broke out, warriors closing in, horses rearing. She pulled wire back into the lodge as gunfire cracked the air. It was over as quickly as it began. The riders withdrew, but not far. She could see them on the ridge, waiting, watching. The shaman gathered the people, his voice grave. She understood enough to know this was only a warning, not the real attack. That night, the camp was restless. No songs, no laughter, only the sound of guards pacing the perimeter. She sat by the fire with Tahama, who said nothing, only sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. In the flames, she thought she saw again the shape the shaman once spoke of, betrayal moving closer, step by step. The morning after the standoff brought no relief. The riders on the ridge were still there, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. The camp moved with quiet urgency, sharpening arrowheads, reinforcing the wooden barricades at the narrow valley pass, checking the supply of food and water. She worked alongside Wire, carrying bundles of firewood, her mind turning over what she had seen and what she remembered from her past life. In the afternoon, Tahama returned from a scouting run. His face was drawn, and he spoke quickly to the shaman. Though she could not understand all of it, she caught the word tomorrow more than once. Whatever would happen, it was coming soon. She found herself watching Tahama as he moved from group to group, giving quiet orders, his presence steady even under the weight of what was ahead. That evening, she approached the shaman. Speaking in slow, careful English, she told him she understood the kind of men on that ridge. How they thought, how they would act. Through Tahama's translation, she explained that their greed would make them careless if tempted with the right bait. Her voice was steady as she outlined her idea: lure them into a trap by making them believe the camp's defenses were weaker than they truly were. The shaman listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, he gave a single nod. Tahama's expression shifted, a flicker of respect passing through the worry. "It may work," he said. "But it will be dangerous." She met his gaze without flinching. "It already is." That night, under a sky scattered with stars, the plan was whispered from fire to fire. Warriors memorized their roles, women prepared decoys, and the children were moved to hidden shelters deep in the valley. She lay awake long after the camp had fallen silent, the beaded necklace cool in her palm. She had been a prisoner once, traded away like a piece of land. Now, for the first time, she felt the weight of choice, and the power to change what came next. Dawn broke in a haze of pale gold, the air tense with the stillness before a storm. The riders on the ridge began to move, their horses picking their way down the slope. From her place near the central fire, she watched the camp transform into the image of vulnerability, warriors positioned as if unprepared, barricades partially dismantled, valuables left in plain sight. Every detail had been arranged the night before, just as she had described. The lead rider with the pale scarf entered first, his smile thin and confident. His men fanned out, rifles loose in their hands, eyes sweeping over the camp. She stood where they could see her, beside the shaman, her face calm but unyielding. In the distance, she knew Tahama and a hidden line of warriors were waiting. The moment came when greed overcame caution. Two riders dismounted to grab a stack of supplies, and the leader barked orders to take more. That was the signal. From behind the lodges and along the ridge, warriors surged forward. Arrows and gunfire cracked the air. Horses reared, men shouted, and the camp's true strength revealed itself in a single, fierce wave. She stayed beside the shaman, helping him move the children toward safety while the battle raged. Through the dust and chaos, she caught sight of Tahama grappling with the leader. The pale scarf came loose, falling to the ground as Tahama forced him down. The remaining riders broke and fled, leaving their wounded behind. When it was over, the valley was quiet except for the sound of labored breathing and the low voices of those tending the injured. Tahama walked to her, his face streaked with dust and sweat. "It worked," he said simply, and there was something in his tone, gratitude, and something more. That night, the fires burned brighter than they had in weeks. The camp sang again, the voices rising into the cool air. She sat among them, no longer apart, feeling the rhythm of the drums in her chest. The shaman passed by, resting a hand on her shoulder. In that touch, she understood that the prophecy had been fulfilled, not by magic alone, but by courage, choice, and the will to stand when the moment came.